Hello, everyone. This is Jayant Bhandari, and today with us is Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Michael Jones is the editor of Cultural Wars magazine, and he has written scores of books. Among them is Libido Dominandi, Dionysus Rising, and The Slaughter of Cities. There are many books that he has written. But today, I want to bring him on to talk a bit about what India can do to improve itself, to emerge out of its wretchedness. And from what I understand, Dr. Jones has also spent a fair bit of time in India. So I want to bring Dr. Jones in and listen to his views on what India should do and can do to improve itself. Dr. Michael Jones, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. Can you hear me?
All is good. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So yes, you're right. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in India, traveled all over the country from north to south, from Mangalore to Delhi, from Mumbai to Calcutta. It was an impressive experience. The one thing that struck me is the number of people there. When I came back to South Bend, Indiana, I kept looking around thinking, where are all the people? India is full of people. That's the good news, because labor is the source of all value. But the question is, can you mobilize labor? And that's a fundamental question that you have to ask when you're in India. When you see women with bowls of dirt on their head, carrying dirt from one spot to another, wondering where the wheelbarrow was, or where even something as rudimentary as that. But I think the crucial experience I had was in Mumbai, and I hope I'm not confusing these events. But I remember going to the temple of Ganesh. Went there and stood in line with the people who were waiting to go to there's a little golden idol of Ganesh there. You stand and wait in line. And while you're waiting in line, the people in line, there are big statues of silver. There are silver rats. And the people go and they put a kind of little cloth on the back of the rat, and they go up and whisper into the rat's ear what they want. From Ganesh, and then you get to the priest. The priest is standing next to Ganesh, and they offer him some type of sacrifice, and he hands a little bit back, and that was the experience. And then we went to the Nehru Science Center, and different experience. Okay, we waiting in line there, and there is a mural. And the mural is of all of human history. And so the end part of the mural is, pretty familiar. It's pretty uncontroversial. But the interesting part is the beginning of the mural. And the absolute beginning says, atoms formed. Well, that doesn't make any sense. What do you mean atoms formed? What did they form from? What made up the first atom? Where did the material come from the first atom? Well, they couldn't say. It was a completely incoherent. So here is this huge kind of scientific edifice, and there's no foundation for it, because science does not deal with beginnings. It can't deal with beginnings. There's one science that deals with beginnings, and that's called metaphysics. And it was created by Aristotle in the 4th century BC as the thing that comes after physics. You can talk about physics, but there's something more important than physics, and that's metaphysics, and that's the beginning of something. And you can't have some type of infinite beginning, okay? So as part of this experience, I had conversations with a number of people in my travels. And one of the most important was at a school. It was a Catholic school. The man who took me around was Father Cyril Fernandez, a Catholic priest who created about 5 schools. And I was really impressed with the schools. It reminded me of when I was a child in the 1950s in America, where the Catholic schools were huge. They had huge numbers of children in them. And so I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia had the largest Catholic grade school in the world with 3,000 students, and the largest Catholic high school in the world with 5,000 students. And they're both gone now. But each school that I went to that had been founded by Father Cyril had between 2,000 and 4,000 students in it. So it was really impressive to see all of these schools and see they all wore school uniforms. So that was impressive too. And so I was taken into this school in Delhi, and it was a school of, it was a class of, I think, 16-year-olds. And they were all proficient. It was an English class. So I gave a little speech and, was nice just to talk to them. And then I said, any questions? And the 16-year-old boy stood up. His name was Samuel. And he said, he was a Hindu. And he said to me, can you prove the existence of God? And I said, yeah, I can. And I thought, this is important here. This is an important moment, because this is precisely what those two first experiences I had lacked. So you had a religion that I don't want to offend anybody, but it's not a rational religion. You can't have a religion with 33 million gods. That's not rational. You can't have a religion with two gods. Okay, there can only be one God, and that's the God that we were talking about at this point.
Right, and you have to offend people if you want to change their minds, though.
I don't want to offend anyone, but I have to say, I have to tell the truth. And if some people find the truth offensive, well, that's not my problem. That's their problem. So I'm not trying to be offensive at all. But at this point, I said there was if there were ever nothing, there can never be something. Because nothing comes from nothing. And then I said, there is something. It's obvious. Look around you. There's a lot of something here. So therefore, there was never nothing. Okay? Now, this something could not bring itself into existence. Because to do that, it would have to exist before it existed. And that's impossible. So therefore, something else had to bring it into existence. And that something is what all men call God. Well, there was a kind of stunned silence at that point, but and then he went on to talk about something else. But I think that was an important moment, because this was a man who was looking for some type of rationality in religion, which he could not find, because on the one hand you had this exaggerated form of rationality known as science that couldn't explain its own beginnings. And on the other hand, you had a religion with 33 million gods, which is not rational. Now you got a big culture that celebrates this religion, but it's not rational. So here was a moment where rationality and religion came together, I think, not for the first time because it was a Catholic school, but that's what happened. And this has been my experience in India. It's like a really fertile soil that's waiting for some type of water, some type of rationality. So I got into online. I got into discussion with another Indian. This guy's name is Ravi, and he's a Punjabi, and he was living in Delhi at the same time. So I never met him in person. It was only till years later that I met him in person. Actually, this past summer, first time I ever met him in person. He's now living in England. His experience was growing up in England. Basically, he's an Englishman. He went back to India and he tried to live there, and he found that he didn't really fit in. So now he's back in England. So anyway, I started talking to him about Logos, because I was writing a book called Logos Rising at the time. And I was writing that book because I'd spent time in Iran. And I was, at this point, trying to understand whether it's possible to talk to people across the world. Because now we have the technological ability, which we're using right now, to talk to people all across the world. We have a language now that is pretty much universal, called English, because it's one of the good fruits of the bad English British Empire. And so we can have these conversations, but do we know what to talk about? Is there anything worth talking about? And so I started talking about the picture of the symbol of the Indian cosmology. And at this point, it's the, you know what it is better than I do. Okay, the world is a kind of semicircle. It's like an orange cut in half. And it's sitting on the back of 4 elephants. And the 4 elephants are standing on a turtle. So I said, what's the turtle standing on? Now, there's an answer to that on the internet. There's a general answer to that. And the answer is, it's turtles all the way down. But that's not an answer. That's what Aristotle would call the infinite regress. You can't have turtles all the way down. There's got to be something under one of those turtles that does not move. Because if you don't have something that doesn't move, the other turtles can't stand on it. This is what Aristotle called the uncaused cause and the unmoved mover. And it's a symbol of the beginning, and it's also a symbol of God. That was Aristotle's God. He didn't know whether he was a human being or not, or whether he cared, what kind of person he was, whether he cared for you. But it was the infinite. It was the infinite as the support of the finite. So as a result of not knowing what the last turtle was standing on, Ravi became a Catholic, because that is the religion of Logos. The religion of Logos. And why do I say that? Is because that's where I got the word. I did study Greek when I was a student in college, and the word Logos, I realized, had all these different words for it. 5 pages of words in English words that were the equivalent, and one of them is word, and that's generally the word that gets used at the beginning. For example, at the beginning of St. John's Gospel, when he says, "In the beginning was the Word." I don't know what that means. I have no idea what that means. I've heard that gospel my entire life. I don't know what it means. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I don't know what that means. But when I learned Greek, I thought, well, no, Logos makes sense. In the beginning, there was Logos. Now, John is talking about. He's writing the New Testament. He's basing on what the Old Testament said. The Old Testament is written in another language, but it begins with, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." That's a real beginning. Because if you're talking about a beginning, you're talking about creation, which is something Aristotle did not know about. You're not talking about change, because creation is not change. Creation is something totally unique. And the only being that can bring about creation is God. And so God, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Aristotle didn't know that, because God had to reveal it to him. And so St. John is taking, in the beginning, there was Logos, and Logos was with God, and Logos is God. Well, that's worth pondering. Logos is God, and suddenly you have that you realize how stupid that atoms form thing is at the beginning of the mural at the Nehru Science Center. And this is the type of situation that is crippling India, because you have to have some type of understanding of beginnings, and you have to have some type of understanding of the relationship between reason and God, which you cannot have if you're talking about a big monkey or something like that. It doesn't work. And so I've been able to talk to Indians in that regard. So I'm on another podcast, and I said I was standing in Mumbai on the banks of the Ganges River. And somebody called in and said, "Wait a minute, the Ganges doesn't flow through Mumbai, it flows through Calcutta." And I said, "Yes, I'm sorry, I just confused the two things." But I said, "You're right." And that was the beginning of another conversation I had. This is with a young man by the name of Shonak Das. And because of that conversation, he became a Catholic. with a lot of trouble. It's not easy to do this in India, okay? But the point I'm trying to make is that after traveling all around the world and especially to Iran and talking to the Muslims there, they believe in one God. It's a kind of Christian heresy, but they don't understand the Trinity. And so I had the sense that what are we talking about? We're talking about the movement of rationality in human history. This is what we're talking about. And everyone, I've said many times, it's like a train. The train of rationality pulls into the station, and the station could be India, or it could be Persia, or it could be any place. And at this point, you get on the train or you don't get on the train. It could be America right now. It could be simply you trying to understand what's happening right now. And you've got baggage. And the baggage you've got is basically the ideas or the forms or the categories that you have formed throughout your entire life. And they will either allow you to understand what's going on, or they will prevent you from understand what was going on. And we're now at a moment of crisis in the world, because the categories that are that are the foundation of the American empire are suddenly, we're realizing that they don't hold together anymore. They don't explain what they're supposed to explain. And whenever you have a situation like this, which generally happens in all empires because they're human creations and they grow and then they decline, you're going to have a sense of crisis. And we are going through this huge sense of crisis right now in America, which is what prompted me to write my most recent book, which is about American identity. There's a Frenchman who wrote a book called La Défaite de l'Occident about this crisis. And he said that the empire is collapsing because the hidden grammar of the American empire is Protestantism, and Protestantism has evaporated basically after 500 years. And so there's no form. And when there's no form, there's a crisis. And when there's a crisis, no one knows how to act. And if you don't know how to act properly, you're going to have violence, because logos, in terms of custom and law, tells you how to act. And if people don't act properly, they're going to get into conflict. And that's what we're having. We're having crisis, a conflict all over the world right now, including a domestic crisis here in America. So this is the moment that we're living in. It's the end of one era and it's the beginning of another. And we're all kind of looking around for some type of explanation. What does it mean to be an American? No one knows anymore. No one knows anymore, because there's one party that thinks it knows and trying to do it, and they don't know really. And the other part thinks that it's bad to be an American and that you shouldn't even try. And to be an American, you have to be a special kind of person. And I'm talking about the Democratic Party, and I'm talking about identity politics. So during the course of this conversation that I had with Ravi, again, I'm talking about people who are extremely bright people. I'm stunned at Shonak has written articles for Culture Wars magazine. I'm stunned at how perceptive this guy is. All you need to do is provide the proper categories, the proper principles, and suddenly the world makes sense to someone that it didn't make sense before. And he was able to simply emerge from the bondage that he was in. It was the bondage of sin. And it was, in particular, it was an addiction to pornography. He's been very open. I'm grateful for him for being open about this pornography addiction. But this rationality, okay, the understanding that the universe is a rational place and that there is a kind of practical rationality. It's called practical reason. It's morality. That also tells you how to live. It's not just the rationality that tells you that the moon will rise at a certain time and that this will happen if you pump atoms together or something like that. There is a rationality to human behavior that you can access as well. And that will allow you to have a successful life. And so this is part of the crisis here in America right now, of the identity crisis. A lot of people are starting to think, they're looking around, they're seeing a lot of new immigrants and they're thinking, what am I? And they're saying, I'm white. No, you're not. There's no such thing as being white. Okay, I'm in the middle of trying to explain to these things. This is a false identity that's going to lead you to nowhere. Okay, and there are cultures that, in many ways, have false identities. And in the discussion I had with Ravi grew up in England, thinking that he was a second class because he wasn't as white as the English. This had a crippling effect on him that he's now overcome, largely because the Catholic Church doesn't have this category of white. It's a Protestant category. But it's allowed discussions that would not have taken place otherwise, including Ravi's own delving into his own identity as an Indian. Like, where did I come from? Like okay, I'm a Punjabi. Okay, that's part of my identity. But what about this ancient culture? You're talking about an ancient culture here. When you're talking about Persia, you're talking about India, you're talking about China, you're talking about ancient cultures, and all of these cultures, in a sense, had some type of beginning with rationality. They all had a word that in some sense corresponded to the term logos. But logos only emerged in Greece naturally. The rationality emerged among the Hebrews because of revelation. The Semitic language is not like Greek. It's very concrete, and they simply did not have the possibility of abstract thought. There is no possibility in Semitic languages.
So, Dr. Jones, why has India, despite being such an old culture, not been able to evolve into monotheistic culture? Why does it continue to be a pagan society, very polytheistic? And as you rightly said, there are millions of gods in the country. Can you also explain why this hasn't changed? Why has India not evolved into a single god country? But also explain to us, what is the problem with having millions of gods?
Yes. Okay, first of all, that was what I was going to talk about with Ravi. So Ravi is looking into, was there a logos in India at the beginning? And there was. It was in the Vedas. You have this term urta, RTA. That's a kind of word for rationality. It's the word for logos. There was something similar in China. The Chinese word was Tao, the Confucianism. And the Jesuits, when they got to China, they were excited because they thought it was logos. Well, it's not. It's not the same thing. So what happened in India? Ravi thinks it's usury. The usury, in other words, lending money at interest, and the nature of compound interest naturally leads to a situation where the country becomes a very few rich people control a large number of poor people. And the rich people are called creditors and the poor people are called debtors. And he's claiming that the caste system is basically the religious codification of usury. That's what he's saying. That's why he's saying why it did not emerge. Okay? So the second question is, why can't you have 33 million gods? Okay, why can't you have two gods? Let's get it simpler. Okay, why can't you have a good God and a bad God? Because that's what happened in Persia. That's what their religion was. Okay, there was a good God, and there are Persians to this day who are come on and they say, well, this explains evil. It's much better than the Christian idea where there's only one God, because now we can explain evil. Well, so yeah, evil comes from the bad God and good comes from the good God. Okay, well, wait a minute. There's a problem here. In order to be God, you have to be all powerful. If you're all powerful, you also have to be all good, because that's the same thing as being. So if you're all powerful, if the good God is all powerful, why doesn't he kill the bad God? Well, there's only two answers to that question. Either he doesn't want to, in which case he's evil, he's not good, or he can't, in which case he's not all powerful. So in either case, he's not God. That's two gods. Okay, that's the fundamental problem here. That's why you have to have one God.
Right. And you said that during your travels in India, you almost never saw a wheelbarrow and the women were carrying weight on their heads.
Right.
Any thoughts on, have you reflected on why India has failed to develop the concept of wheelbarrow, despite that they have now been watching that concept for hundreds of years? Why have they not implemented the wheelbarrow so far?
Because India is committed to cheap labor. I think that this is, I think the political class has decided we are going to be the cheap labor capital of the world. And cheap labor is self-defeating because at a certain point, someone's always going to undercut your wages. Okay. And that's the problem here. So again, talking to Ravi, Ravi had a woman, a servant, coming and cleaning his apartment. Okay. And she would come in and she'd sit down on the floor and she'd have a rag and she'd stand on the floor and she'd rub the floor with the rag. And then she'd get up and then she'd move over a little bit and then rub the floor. And then she'd get up and move over a little bit. And he thought to her, well, I think I'm going to buy her a mop. Okay. So he bought a mop and he tried to explain to the woman how to use the mop. And so she kind of liked it. And then the next day she shows up, no mop. Where's the mop? He said. Well, her boss wouldn't allow her to use a mop. So you got a situation there where you're confronting a fundamental, because there are so many people in India, these certain people have decided, well, it's a resource. It is a resource. Okay, human labor is a resource. Okay, human labor is the source of all value. So that's true. But you have to be able to apply logos to labor. And if you don't do that, it's going to be self-defeating. And so the self-defeating idea in India is that they've identified themselves as the cheap labor capital of the world. And they use these women because they're cheap labor, not because they're efficient, but because they're cheap labor. And so cheap labor is crippling. First, it's crippling the economy. It's crippling development in India because as soon as you're not cheap labor, you go someplace else. And so Father Cyril's brothers are all working in Dubai and hotels and stuff like that. Or they come over here with visas and they become computer programmers over here in the United States. They love to have these Indians come over. And so, but you're stuck here. Like my oldest son worked for Ford and he had to deal with Indians because there was a Ford plant in Chennai. So it's a stupid idea, okay, because you got to get up in the middle of the night and you're constantly arranging meetings all the way around the world and so on and so forth. But what he started to realize is that the Indian, again, I don't want to be offensive here, but they weren't capable of independent working because of the habits they had acquired in India of the kind that I'm talking about with this lady. And so what you're confronted with here is, Heinrich Pesch said it. I wrote a book called Barren Metal about the development of economics, the conflict between labor and usury in the economy, in economies throughout the world. And he said, there's a paradox here. Cheap labor always leads to higher labor costs. Low wages always lead to higher labor costs, because you're not applying the rationality you need to the job. And you're basically paying, look, I'm going to pay you. It doesn't matter what, you just do what I say. And so people just say, if I stand, so if I say, go stand in the corner and count jelly beans, you go over and stand in the corner and you count jelly beans. The rational thing, and this is the development of labor in Europe, which is the crucial thing, was basically based on logos, on the development of the ideas that we had about logos. And so I've been dealing, again, I'm telling you, in the United States right now, there are a lot of people who think they're white, and I'm there, and when they talk to me, they say, look at Africa. And it's because those Africans have bad DNA, because look at, I gave, some guy actually told me this. The average IQ in Haiti is 75. This told me this with a straight face. I said, when did the Haitians ever take IQ tests? How do you know this? You're extrapolating. Oh, it's because, so what's the difference then? What's the difference between Africa and Europe? Well, I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, what's the difference? And I gave him, when I was in Tanzania, someone handed me a brochure about the collaboration between the Diocese of Würzburg and the Diocese of Mbinga. Diocese of them, it's about coffee. They're trying to give people in the Mbinga a fair price for their coffee, and the Germans can roast it the way they want it, and everybody's happy. It's a win-win situation. Okay, so what's the mean? What are we talking about here? Look at the Diocese of Mbinga. When is that founded? 1983. Okay, when was the Diocese of Würzburg founded? 752. That's the difference. That's the difference, because my, German barbarian ancestors used to love to chase pigs through the forest. Okay, until the Benedictine monks sailed down the Danube and built monasteries and brought agriculture, specifically wine, grapes, to them. And then they were able to become much more productive. So what's the difference between Mbinga and Würzburg? It's about 1,500 years of Christianity, which means logos applied to labor. This is the problem with India. It's the problem with Africa, and it was the problem that the Jesuits, for example, found when they came to North America and South America. And the exception to the rule is what the Jesuits did when they showed up in Paraguay. Paraguay was hunter-gatherer. It's a nice place. They had cattle just roaming around, and the Indians there, the Guarani Indians, would kill the cow or kill the steer, whatever it was, and sit there and eat it. That's what the Abnaki did in Quebec, except it was a moose. This is the life. If the moose doesn't show up, you're in trouble. You have to wait till the snow's waist deep. You have to stab the moose, and you sit there and you eat the thing. The Jesuits brought to the Guarani a new way of thinking, and within 3 generations, not only did they have them basically a market economy, they were making instruments and playing the violin within 3 generations. This was an extraordinary achievement. It was not capitalism. It was not that ruthless exploitation of fellow human beings that the Protestants brought to North America, the Puritans brought to North America. It was a whole way of creating wealth out of organized labor, and it was destroyed, strangled in its grave by the Freemasons. And if you want to watch the movie, it's called The Mission. That's what we're talking about here. That's what the situation throughout the world, and I think it's the situation in India.
So Dr. Jones, Christianity has been in India for hundreds of years, probably more than a millennia. Why has it failed to gain traction, and why has it a tendency to become voodoo in that country? And I see the same situation in sub-Saharan Africa as well.
Yes, that's a good question. Okay, so if you're talking about St. Thomas, it's been there a long time. He was one of the apostles. If you're talking about the expansion into the New World, the Portuguese brought it to Goa. And when I was in Goa, I went to the shrine of St. Francis Xavier. And his body is there. It's not doing as well as it should. His body is incorrupt because the Jesuits chopped off his arm and sent it to Rome so that they could make him a saint and have a relic. Bad idea. But anyway, the Indian women, both Muslim and Hindu, stand there in front of St. Francis Xavier body, and they're praying to him. They are impressed by this. So the question is, why is he there? Why? Because he really didn't spend a lot of time in India. He got to India. I think he was discouraged simply by the magnitude of the task in front of him. He was just overwhelmed. He was looking. Look, when you get to a completely strange place, you have to look for logos. And the first thing you've got to do is learn the language. And that's what Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit, did in China. You have to learn the language. That's exactly what the Jesuits did in Paraguay. They learned Guarani. The only reason Guarani is one of the official languages of Paraguay is because the Jesuits sat down and wrote the grammar and wrote the dictionary. So they preserve the language. You have to learn the language. And he looks at India. I think he was overwhelmed. I think he thought, this is too big for me. I just can't do it. India is overwhelming. It is overwhelming. There are so many people. There are so many languages. There's so many this, that, the other thing. So he left and he went to Japan. And the first thing he did when he went to Japan was he took out a telescope and an astrolabe and he started to talk about the calendar. And he had big success because basically what he's saying is, if I can predict where the movement of the stars, that logos, maybe I can tell you more about the logos of practical reason, and maybe you should listen to me because I'm the messenger of the logos incarnate, Jesus Christ. That man came down, and so there was a movement forward, and then that the tragedy of history. If you want, there's another movie called Silence, where you can look about it's a Scorsese movie about the tragedy of this. What should I say? The nativist reaction whenever Christianity arrives. There's always going to be a nativist reaction because there are local people who are the local religious authorities, whatever you want to call them, the bonza in Japan, and they didn't like it. And you're talking about showing up in Japan at the very moment when Protestantism has caused one huge civil war in Europe. And basically those guys are fighting over the trading rights. The Dutch are fighting with the Portuguese, and they show up in Japan and China, and they're saying, don't listen to that guy. That guy's crazy. Okay, he's a Calvinist. And the Japanese are saying, what's a Calvinist? I never heard of this before. I thought you both believed in Jesus Christ. And now this guy is trying to cheat me out of a decent price for tea or whatever it is. That was precisely the scandal that took place in Japan, and also even more so in China. Because as I said, Matteo Ricci, the Jesuits did get to China. Now you have a high civilization. Okay, like India. It's not like going into the woods in Paraguay or in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a high civilization, but you got to learn the language. And that's what Matteo Ricci did. He learned Mandarin. He was talking to people, doing the same thing. Look, your calendar's out of whack. Why is it snowing in July in China? Because your calendar's out of whack. Let me straighten out your calendar. And they're thinking, wow, if this guy can do that, maybe we should listen to him. And they did listen to him. And he not only learned the language, he wrote one of the classics in Chinese literature. And so it's ready. Now we're ready to make some serious progress. He's ready to meet with the emperor. But the problem is there's a conflict back in Rome. Well, what are these pagans? And the Jesuits are trying to talk to the Dominicans, saying, look, no, it's not what you think. Well, they worship their ancestors. Well, so do you worship your ancestors too, don't you? Depending on what you mean by worship. I mean, don't you go to the cemetery and put flowers on your mother's grave? Is that what we're talking about here? It went back and forth. And then again, this kind of, as with St. Francis Xavier, he died. He was going to be smuggled. He didn't have a visa. There were these snakeheads who were going to smuggle him into China, and he died on the island waiting for them to show up. And now Matteo Ricci dies. And the conflict is resolved in Rome, saying, no, we can't have this. They're going to have to do something. They're going to have to get rid of their culture. And the Jesuits were saying, well, maybe there's something we can hold on to in the culture. So now a new guy shows up, and he walks into the emperor, and he can't speak Chinese. And the emperor is saying, well, interpret those. He couldn't do it. And so the emperor says, well, you're wasting my time. You come here and you can't speak the language. And then so now you got Franciscans walking into some village, they're waving a crucifix and talking something in Portuguese and hoping it's getting translated into Chinese. Well, that's a long stretch. And so this is the tragedies of history that we need to overcome. It's still a work in progress. That's China, that's Japan. Something similar happened in India. I've already talked about St. Francis Xavier. when the English arrived, they conquered India. The English they didn't believe in Christianity. They may have said they did. They had this Anglican church. It was Protestantism. And Protestantism at this point was indistinguishable from capitalism. And capitalism is state-sponsored usury, which is what got India into problem in the first place. And so basically you had the educational system was revolutionized by the Macaulays into a kind of technical, basically the same thing happened in America. Public education is for slaves. Public education is for factory workers. It's for you to just know your place and pull the lever and go home and do what you're told. The other education, you go to Harvard, and that's where you're going to become a ruler. And so what happened is in India, the educated classes before this point learned Persian poetry, which I think is worth learning. And I think it's a better language than this technical stuff that they learned with Macaulay. And so as a result, you never really, the British were never interested in converting the Indians. They used religion as a form of control. This is precisely the problem with Protestantism, and it's precisely the problem with America, and that's what's collapsing as we speak right now.
Right. Okay, great. Dr. Jones, let's have a question from Shashank as next. Shashank, go ahead, please, and keep it brief.
Yes, I have a few set of questions. Michael, I want to know why should believing in one God is rational? And that's the first question. And second one is, what about the idea of there is no beginning? And what about the Big Bang theory, which is cyclic, which means you'll come back again and again? And
yes.
The third question is, one more last question. There are religions of Indian origin which are atheist by nature, like Jainism and Buddhism. They don't believe in God. And why not believing in God is not being rational?
Okay, these are really difficult questions. Now, there was one I was going to answer. So let's go through them one at a time. So tell me the questions again, one at a time.
Okay, Shashank, say one question at a time, okay?
Yeah, believing in one God is rational. Why is that? Why can't I believe in 2-3 gods? And why can't I simply be an atheist? That is, I don't believe in God at all.
Atheism is irrational. And so if you read, you want the details, there was a kind of fad, an intellectual fad known as the new atheism in America, the four atheists, Christopher Hitchens, Dawkins, two other guys. And what was the guy? Dennett was the only philosopher among them. So when they're talking about rationality, or they're really talking about Darwinism, and Darwinism means everything evolved from something else. Well, it's got to begin somewhere, okay? And so Dennett is the only philosopher among the atheists, and he says, the world evolved. What was it? The world evolved from itself, or something. The world brought itself into being from nothing, or something very small. That has got to be the dumbest statement in the history of philosophy. Okay, first of all, the world cannot bring itself into being because it would have to exist before it existed, which is impossible. Okay, so that's wrong. And then secondly, from nothing or something very small. Well, even if it's really small, like Dr. Seuss said, a person's a person, no matter how small. Okay, if it's already small, it's already in existence. That's irrational. Here are guys who are talking about how rational they are when they're making fools out of themselves. And so you've got Dawkins, who's a biologist, who thinks he can figure this out from biology, and he's talking about how there's two possibilities. How do you get from nothing to something? He doesn't quite say it that way, but he's talking about how did the eye come into existence? Okay, well, it began with light-sensitive cells. This is what Christopher Hitchens says. And then he goes through this mumbo-jumbo about light-sensitive cells. Okay, let's get to the cut to the chase here. Those light sensitive cells can either see, in which case they are already an eye, or they cannot see, in which case they will never become an eye, because you cannot go from nothing to something. That which is cannot come from that which is not. Period. That's Parmenides. That's a long way before Darwin. And the stupid Englishmen don't understand metaphysics. They've had trouble ever since William of Ockham. Okay? They're metaphysically challenged. And these are the people that ruled you for whatever, centuries. Okay? Now, let's go. I don't know which question I answered. Let's go to, tell me which question I didn't answer.
On the Big Bang theory, what are your thoughts on the theory that it is cyclic and it just keeps, expanding and contracting?
It's an attempt to use physics as a substitute for metaphysics. So what banged? What banged? There had to be something there. It was this little thing that was incredibly dense matter, and that exploded. Well, where did that come from? Did it bring itself into existence? No, that's impossible, because it would have to exist before it existed. Well, what is the only possible way that could come into existence, that anything can come to existence? It had to be created by God. And so we're back at square one. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. There is no other rational explanation for existence, period. That's it.
Yes, one more question on that. Where was God in existence when there was no existence?
You're this is good. God is a pure being, self-subsistent being. There never was a time when there was not God. That's the difference between God. We have to understand there is a difference between the creator and creation. Okay, creation comes into existence at time. During time, there is no time with God. It's eternal. There never was a time, that's a misnomer, when there wasn't God. God is the pure subsistent being that has always been there. So you can't go beyond that. That's what the creator is. That's the unmoved mover. Aristotle figured that out all on his own, simply by deducing it from the possibility of change not being infinite. That's the difference.
All right. Let's have Arnold next. Arnold, go ahead, please.
Hi, to my friend. I have a question, Mr. Michael Jones. Is that when you talk about Christianity being this idea of logos, do you mean Christianity inherently will fix the, for example, uncivilized region of the world by bringing it the idea of logos?
Yes, that's what civilization is. That's what it is. So let's back up. The story is that God created two people, Adam and Eve, and then that they committed a sin against him. And as a result, the world changed dramatically. That's the word. I'm talking about Vico now, the Italian philosopher, who talked about, first guy who really talked about time. Second guy, St. Augustine, talked about time. The problem with Aristotle is he didn't understand time. Okay, that's the whole problem with Aristotelian metaphysics, because things do change, and you got to come up with some type of explanation of how they change. So, how do things come into existence? And at this point, you have the failure of something, and you fall back, and everyone was in a desperate situation where they simply did not have the powers that God gave them at the beginning, and they have to struggle now. And the sense I had the sense when I was in Africa. So I'm in the Eastern Africa, which is savanna, which is grassland. And this is where the lions are. And there's a lion and there's a gazelle. And everybody's wondering, it's a park, and everybody's wondering, is the lion going to eat the gazelle? And we're all waiting, and nothing happened, because lions pretty much sit around all day and do nothing until they get really hungry. But I thought of standing there. You stand there and the grass is pretty high. And the fact, if you stand there in that grass, you can't see the lion. It's really hard to see. You think something that big, but it's really hard. They fit in. And I'm trying to think, how can I survive in an environment like this? This is what humanity was faced with, this kind of struggle for daily existence that led to, there's archaeological evidence for this kind of slow emergence out of the state of almost helplessness that you can document along the Eurasian landmass with the emergence of things like the wheel and stuff like that. I got into a discussion when I was in Mashhad in Iran. This friend is always trying to arrange discussion with this mullah, the clergy, the Muslim clergy. And I tried to talk about the wheel and the emergence of the wheel and the horse and things like this and what that enabled in terms of progress. And he said, no, that's wrong. I said, what's wrong? He said, the invention of the wheel. Man did not invent the wheel. I said, well, where did it come from? And he said, a prophet invented the wheel. I said, wait a minute, how do you know this? He said, it's in the hadith. And so what you have here is Islam, in a sense, being crippled by this kind of fundamentalism where all knowledge has to come from the Quran. Now, these are monotheists, okay, which is a big step forward from having 33 million gods. But even with monotheism, they have led the culture, Islamic culture, I'm talking about the Iran, Shia Islam, into a kind of fundamentalism that is completely counterproductive. And so as a result, they have real serious problems that they cannot solve, sexuality being one of the main serious problems that they have in Iran. So I'm saying this is the state of all humanity. And this is why humanity needed some type of redeemer, because it couldn't get out of this mess on its own, even with the Redeemer. Look at all the mess that was created because of the miscommunication and the failures in China and so on and so forth. Even with that's the struggle. But that's the progress of Logos in human history. And the vehicle of Logos is the Logos incarnate. It's the vehicle of Logos is Jesus Christ is the Logos incarnate. The vehicle of Logos is the Catholic Church. And where the Catholic Church was incorporated into the culture, you had enormous breakthroughs in every area. Every area. Like Italy, for example. I just did a book called The Dangers of Beauty. Art emerged in Italy in a way that had never happened anyplace else in the world. What is Italy? Have you ever been there? It's this stony, mountainous peninsula where it's impossible to get from one city to another unless you sail around from one city, use the ocean. It's got soil that's not really fertile except for the Po Valley, and yet it was one of the greatest achievements in every area of human life in the late Middle Ages. From art to economics, double entry bookkeeping, to science, Galileo, all of these people, simply because of Logos. Because they internalized that Logos, and that culture made a leap forward that had never happened before. You never had painting like the type of painting you had in Italy. And that's one of the most major forms of civilization, namely art, the imitation of nature. All simply because of Logos.
All right, let's have Rex next. Rex, please keep it very brief. Rex, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yeah, hi Jayant. So
Hi.
I wanted to ask Dr. Jones about what does he think of India's support of the multipolar world, and does he think that the same powers which have controlled Pax Americana till now are trying to destroy it and replace it with a new Eurasian model?
Yeah, look, the empire, the American empire, was taken over by Jews. They do this periodically. They took over the American empire, and they are destroying it right now because, first of all, because of war. They're always getting involved in wars, okay, which we cannot win. NATO is losing the war in the Ukraine, and Israel, the America's proxy or whatever you want to call it, is losing the war in the Middle East. Okay, now one of the weapons of war in the United States empire is called sanctions. And sanctions there's an office at the Treasury Department, and it's totally controlled by Jews. Okay. And they use sanctions to punish people. The dollar is the reserve currency. That's one of the main sources of wealth in the United States. And they use the world banking system. They exclude people from the world banking system to punish them, to make them fall in line. They have way overplayed their hand. Okay, I'm talking about the Jews, people like Stuart Eisenstadt at the Treasury, Sanctions Office in the Treasury, to the point where now, when I last heard this, 40% of the world's population lives in countries that are under sanction by the United States of America. This is really stupid. This is another indication of why you should not let Jews take control of your culture. They are wrecking a really good deal on the part of the United States because they're overreaching. Okay, the reaction is going to be bricks. The people are going to say, no, we're going to trade in our own currency, or we'll have another currency, or so on and so forth. And so one of the major blows, I mean, we have a Secretary of State by the name of Anthony Blinken that is the worst Secretary of State in the history of the United States of America because he can't talk. Logos is talking. It's speech. It means you walk into a room and say, all right, we're going to talk together. We're going to come up with some type of mutually agree. No, he doesn't do that. He's one thing he knows how to say is I have relatives who died in the Holocaust. That's it, period. So he shows up. That's the get out of jail card for every politician in the Biden administration. So he shows up in Saudi Arabia, and guess what? Nobody shows up at the airport to meet him because everybody hates him because he can't talk. He's a shill for Israel. I want to talk to the real American here, not the Jewish shill for Israel. So as a result, Saudis now are trading with China, and they're not using the dollar. This is a natural outcome of the overreach and the overuse of sanctions by this Jewish control of our culture and the Treasury Department.
All right, let's have Samir next. Samir, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Dr. Jones, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, you raised a very good point about the Jews controlling the US. So they control the banks, they control the Federal Reserve, they control Hollywood, they control pharmaceutical, they control almost all industries. But I just would like to raise one point that these are not religious Jews; they are satanic Jews. They are Frankenstein, like most of the Jews, like Rothschild and everything. They came from a breed called Frankenstein, which is Sabbatai Jews. Sabbatai Zevi was a false prophet who was a Kabbalist and who introduced this concept. And they gathered at a place. And they were called Donme. So now these satanic Jews are controlling USA, and they're manipulating, and they are bringing all the evils like feminism, multiculturalism, ending all the organized religion. But if we say something, there are like 90% of I feel that 70 to 80% of the Jews, or 90% even, they are innocent, they are very good. But these 10% Jews, especially the Kabbalists, they are creating a problem all over the world. And the problem is they are not keeping it only till America. They are exporting their degeneracy and immorality like all over the world. And there are no Christians left to defend that. 90% of the people in America and Europe don't go to church. I'm not telling that what's your opinion. I'm not even complaining what's your opinion about Islam something. But at least there are 1.2 billion Muslims. Most of them go to mosque. You can consider Islam as a false. I like your opinion, but at least the Christians are not even there to defend Christianity against these satanic Jews. That's my question.
Okay. This is a puzzle. Okay, Jewish identity is a puzzle. It's hard to figure out because the Jews will never be honest about you. And I had to do this because when the war broke out, when America invaded Iraq, I thought, wait a minute, this has no benefit for the United States of America. It's all because Jews have taken over our country. And they were behind it. They were called neoconservatives at that point. Okay. So the question I had to say, well, what is Jewish identity? What does it mean to be a Jew? And in order to answer that question, I had to write a book called The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. I wrote that book 15 years ago. So in order to do that, I had to go back to the beginning. Like, what's the beginning? the beginning of this problem is when Jesus Christ arrives on this earth. He's the Messiah of the Jews. And the Jews at this point have to make a decision. Do we accept the Messiah on his terms, or do we want a Messiah that has to fit our terms, like a military leader? And that's the big crisis that's in the gospel, especially the Gospel of St. John, which is the one I talked about, where he begins by, in the beginning there was Logos, and the confrontation of between the Jews. Now, this is a term, this is a category that he uses, hoi judaioi. He uses the word 71 times. This is a category of reality, not a category of the mind, which is what the Jews always say. If you say the Jews do this or that, they always say it's a category of your mind, and that's because you're an anti-Semite. No, it's a category of reality. Hoi judaioi, the Jews, and the Jews confront Jesus Christ, and they play the race card. They say, we have special DNA. We are the seed of Abraham. And Jesus says, God doesn't need your DNA. Okay. If you want to be a child of God, which is different than DNA, you have to accept me as the Messiah. And then he says, but you're rejecting me. And then he says, your father is Satan. So you're right. There is something satanic about the Jews, because that's what Jesus Christ said. What is satanic? The satanic nature of the Jews is the rejection of Logos. It's the rejection of reason. It's the rejection of the Logos incarnate, and they killed him. Now, when I say the Jews, I'm not saying all Jews, because Jesus Christ's mother was, in some sense, a Jew. It's a pejorative term in the Gospel of St. John. And it comes out, the conflict, the distinction I'm trying to make comes out in the passage of the man born blind. Parents of the man born blind refused to speak out of fear of the Jews, because the Jews threatened to expel from the synagogue anyone who said that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, they were Jews. Well, no, Jew has a different meaning now. By this point in history, the Jew is the rejecter of Christ. Now, that it doesn't matter whether you're an Orthodox Jew or whether you're a flaming communist Bolshevik Jew or a transgender promoting Jew or a pornographic, they're all one group of people, and their identity is rejection of Logos. And that's the source of problems right now, and it's been a source of problems for 2,000 years. Because when you reject Logos, you reject the order of the universe. When you reject the order of the universe, you become a revolutionary, and you want to overturn the social order wherever you go. And that's the problem with India as well. India, the subversion of Indian morality through the cell phone, through pornography, is having tremendous effects right now, and it's traceable to the Jews. And I wrote an article about this. It's available at culturewars.com about the whole, when Bollywood decided to go international, okay? And the brokers, the power brokers in the film industry, which is Hollywood, which are Jews, basically specified R-rated movies. You have to do R-rated movies, which means sex, which means nudity, which means sex, which means that's going to have a subversive effect on your culture. It was the Jews who created the Communications Decency Act, which put pornography on the internet in the United States, and it's been a curse, especially on India, because of the rape crisis that it basically has provoked. And again, you want to talk about firsthand experience, read Shonak Das's memoir about being addicted to pornography, and I was liberated from it by his conversion.
All right, Dr. Jones, we have been talking for more than an hour. There are actually a lot of people who want to ask questions. So do you have a few more minutes, or you want to close it?
Yeah, let's do a couple more questions.
Okay, so let's have JNR as the next caller. JNR, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jayant. I got in a bit late, so I must say my question may well be out of order or inappropriate. But I must say, listening to this, it sounds, I hate to be blunt and rude about it, so apologies to Dr. Jones. But this is just another mad rant. And we've heard many such mad rants from the likes of Zakir Naik, the fellow called J. Sai Deepak, who all try to uh, minimize the problems of the world into one issue and come up with their one solution. And much of what I heard sounds like another cult rant, which gets us nowhere fast. It neither is a complete and total analysis of the problem, nor does it offer a meaningful and rational solution. I rejected almost 95%. Let me finish on just one last point. When it comes to India and the Christian movement coming to India, every religion in the world has washed up on India's shores. The reason that none of those took root in India was because India was already one of the richest, most educated, most erudite, most advanced civilizations at the time these religions landed on India's shores. And that is brilliantly shown in William Dalrymple's book about how India was at one, or at least the landmass that is now India, it wasn't one country, I accept that, was the birthplace of many civilizational ideas that spread across the world. So this idea that there is one particular religion or one particular faith and so on is complete nonsense. The reason India did not develop as fast as the Protestant Europe or later on when they moved into America was, in my view, one could make a case for this. I'm not saying it is right, it is the right view, is India's capitalist oriented system, which linked up particularly badly and particularly malevolently with India's caste structure, which prevented the individual spirit from taking off. And the great strength of the Protestant movement in the West, particularly in Europe during the sort of Renaissance, was the idea that the individual is more important than the group or the family. And that allowed innovation, scientific innovation, development, exploration, and so on to develop. And that led to an element of racial superiority, a complex of we are the superior race, and that led to colonization of the world. So there are many alternative competing ideas, and Dr. Jones is just one of them. And in my considered view, and once again apologies to him if I'm being very blunt, it is on the extreme fringe element of it, almost equivalent to any other cult movement that you can find loads of examples of if you search the internet.
Well, again, you're right. You didn't come in on the beginning of the conversation. And so to call my discussion of the movement of Logos in human history a rant is stupid. I mean, I'll be blunt too. You missed the whole point of what I said here. And then and the irony here is that you're talking about as an Indian, and yet this whole notion of the individual, this is Whig history. Do you know what Whig history is? You should, because that's what you're spouting. You probably don't even know what you're talking about. This was the Protestant idea of progress that got imposed on the entire world during the British Empire. And you're still talking like a colonial from the British Empire with these obsolete Protestant categories. So, you should have listened from the beginning. Okay. So listen, I'm here because life is short and art is long. And we're doing a conversation across the world where I have to get everything out in a short period of time. So ignore what I'm saying here. Okay. And you can retreat into this kind of weird combination of Whig history and Indian chauvinism if you want. But if you don't, I recommend reading Logos Rising. Okay. It's a book. I'm just here to talk about ideas that are in books. If I'm not persuasive at this point, okay, you're probably not going to read the book, but you should read the book, because all you're proposing is the return to a new form of obsolete ideas like pluralism, like individualism, all of the things that were associated with the Protestant British Empire that conquered India and then did nothing to help it out, exploited it. So no, sorry if I'm being blunt here, but you should have listened from the beginning of the conversation.
All right, let's have Heidi next. Heidi, please keep it very brief.
Thank you. I will be very brief. Thank you, Dr. Michael Jones, for everything. I totally agree with everything you've said on this panel. And I also thank you because I heard you on a podcast one time and you advised to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, 200 Years Together, the Russo-Jewish history. And it's a powerhouse of what was going on with the Jews way back when, especially, I believe it was Catherine the Great, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Jones. And one more thing, and I'm done. What was the name of the book about the porn addiction? You said the name of the book, but it was too fast. I couldn't write it down. But thank you very much for your insights. Totally appreciated.
You're welcome. The book is Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control.
Got it. Thank you.
That's exactly what Shonak understood. All I had to do was say that to Shonak, and he was able to kick the pornography addiction. As I said before, you're welcome. You're welcome. And as I said before, you know better than I do the rape crisis that is the fundamental expression of pornography, the effect of pornography on India right now.
Absolutely. I've been to India plenty of times, more than 10 to 11 times. I have a U.S. passport and I got my 10-year visa to there. So, yeah, thank you very much for all your insights, Dr. Jones.
You're welcome.
All right, let's have Alex next. Alex, go ahead. You are on mute right now. Alex, go ahead, please. You are on mute.
Hi, Jayant. Hi, Michael. I just want to say there was a guy who Samir who came earlier. He said 90% Jews are innocent, but he is forgetting that around 80 to 90% Jews are IDF or ex-IDF members. Some are even Mossad members. So basically, they are reservists. They're military legitimate targets. They're not.
I'm sorry. I can't understand what you're saying. You're speaking too fast. I can't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I know. Earlier there was a guy who came up who was talking about Jews, that 90% of Jews are innocent, but he's forgetting that around majority of the Jews are IDF or ex-IDF members. Some are even Mossad members. So basically, they are not civilians. They are reservists and military targets. So telling them that they are innocent is like injustice to Palestinians and other people who they have done wrong. Now coming to India, the William Dalrymple is kind of a fanboy. So reading his analysis is biased towards India. If you want to actually know about India, listen to Miss Audrey Truske. I think that's her name. She's a lady, Miss Audrey. Her analysis was very good regarding India. First of all, the Indian society is based on caste, which is separation of people. Basically, someone is superior and someone is inferior. Also, lower caste people were not allowed to read. So basically, what the overseas Indian you are seeing are most of the upper caste Indians. So basically,
Giant.
I actually I have the same problem. I can't really hear him properly. Alex, can you just very briefly ask your question without saying too much? Your connection is not too good.
Okay. Did you listen? Did you listen to the Jews part?
Yes, I did. Yes. Can you just ask a very brief question?
Yeah. My question is: Indian people are not trying to accept the Christianity. So how they can themselves accept it, or how Christianity can success in India right now?
Can you repeat that, Giant?
I'm sorry, I didn't get it either. Let's have Terminus next. We are short of time.
Yeah. Wait a minute. My question is, how can Christianity succeed now in India?
Okay,
because most Indian people don't want it.
Okay, I think I heard that. Yeah. How can Christianity succeed? Christianity is succeeding right now in those schools that I visited during my trip through India. The schools that I visited, 80% of the students are Hindus. And Samil was one of those Hindu students who was being exposed to Logos, and that's why he asked that question. So Christianity is succeeding right now in India. Everybody wants to go to those schools. That's a generalization from a guy who came from someplace else, but those schools are packed, and they are carrying Logos, the cause of Logos forward in India right now as we speak. It's not some type of waiting for something to happen. It's already happening.
All right. Let's have Terminus next. Terminus, keep it very brief, please. Yeah.
You spoke of Logos. You must know this Catholic writer in the 70s, Ivan Illich. He was Austrian, I think. So he wrote a book on the energy crisis then. So I was very impressed by this. He had this notion that after a certain point, the energy system takes over. So most of the work goes in maintaining that infrastructure. He was he wrote many. He was a Catholic writer. He wrote many books during the post-war period. So he said that after a certain development, which he compared, I think, of Mexico in the 70s. He said Mexico at that point was just crossing that point where it can sustain multiple kinds of lifestyles in the industry, geared around the industrial economy, but if they reach American levels, then only one kind of lifestyle is possible. So he was warning that again. So what he saw was that this will happen all over the third world. So he was warning against that possibility. Can you tell me about, because it links with your logos, that
Okay. First of all, Christianity did come to Mexico. Mexico was making progress forward because the native population was intermarrying with the Spaniards and so on and so forth. They were making progress in a way that was slow, but okay. And then they were taken over by the Freemasons. The Freemasons took over Mexico and turned it into basically what Protestant countries, Protestant ideology always do, where there's an elite class that views the local population as the enemy, and they're working for foreign elites. That's what happened when the Freemasons took over Mexico. The crucial factor in Mexico that basically destroyed the economy was GATT and NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which flooded Mexico with cheap corn. This killed local production. The local farmers, the subsistence farmers, the basic level of agricultural economy could not survive. They could not survive by agriculture, and so as a result, they started heading to the United States of America. A huge drain on the Mexican population. They flooded into America and created a kind of immigration crisis here, which is, I don't think it's that serious, but these are the things you have to know about the Mexican economy. That throughout all of South America, you had what could have been a promising development. I mentioned the Jesuits in Paraguay was killed by Freemasonry. And Freemasonry is British imperialism. And British imperialism basically wrecked the economies of South America all the way up to Argentina. Okay, Argentina was the third largest economy in the world until the British wrecked their economy by lending the money and then forcing them to pay outrageous payments to back the loan. And then when they used money, they used Argentinian beef basically during World War II to feed the people because they couldn't feed them themselves, and then they wouldn't pay them back. So this is the tragedy of South America and Mexico. Okay, I can do one more question, and then I got to get out of here.
Okay, last question, Dr. X. Go ahead, please.
Jones, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, the question is, do you see a pattern in how the Indians are being lifted to top positions in the West?
Giant, you're going to have to repeat the question.
He asked a question about Indians reaching high positions in politics in the Western society.
Well, you're talking about Vivek, I think, and Nikki Haley, Kamala. It's the natural consequence of immigration. So when I was a young man, okay, there was very, very few Indians here. That changed with the visas, bringing all the people, the computer programmers here. And so once you get a certain number of people here, they're naturally going to want to get in political office. It's just natural. So there's nothing unusual about that.
All right. Dr. Michael Jones, thank you very much for your time today. And thanks other people for joining the call. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye now.